The year is 1462. A vast Ottoman army, over 90,000 strong, marches confidently through the Wallachian countryside under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror himself. These are the same soldiers who brought Constantinople to its knees less than a decade ago. They have crushed empires and reduced ancient cities to rubble. Nothing, they believe, can stand in their way. But as they approach the capital city of Târgoviște, the mighty army grinds to a halt. Hardened warriors, veterans of countless sieges and battles, begin to vomit. Some fall to their knees in prayer, others simply turn and flee. Before them stretches a sight that defies comprehension. A forest, but not of trees. This is a forest of the dead. For nearly half a mile in every direction, wooden stakes pierce the darkening sky. Upon each stake, a human body writhes or hangs motionless, impaled through the torso and left to die in unimaginable agony. The chroniclers would later estimate that 20,000 corpses decorated this grotesque garden. Men, women, children, Ottomans captured in previous raids, all displayed as a macabre welcome for the invading sultan. The stench of death is overwhelming. Clouds of crows and vultures circle overhead, their cries the only sound in the eerie silence. Even Mehmed II, who had shown no mercy to the defenders of Constantinople, is reported to have said, "I cannot conquer a man who does things like this." This was the work of one man, Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, and to legend as the inspiration for Count Dracula. His name would become synonymous with cruelty, his methods the stuff of nightmares that haunted Europe for centuries. But who was this prince who could terrify the mightiest empire on earth? What drove him to such extremes of violence? And were the stories about him true, or were they the propaganda of his enemies, amplified through centuries of retelling? To understand the monster, we must first understand the man. And to understand the man, we must journey back to a world where violence was the currency of power, where kingdoms rose and fell with the swing of a sword, and where survival often demanded the abandonment of every principle we hold dear. This is the story of Vlad Dracula, not the vampire of fiction, but the real prince whose deeds were far more terrifying than any supernatural tale could ever be. Wallachia in the 15th century was a land caught between giants. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful force in the known world, constantly expanding, constantly hungry for new territories. To the north lay Hungary, a Christian kingdom that viewed Wallachia as a buffer zone against Ottoman expansion. The Wallachian princes were forced to navigate between these two powers, paying tribute to both, trusted by neither and constantly vulnerable to assassination, invasion, or both. Into this world of intrigue and violence, Vlad was born sometime around 1431, likely in the Transylvanian city of Sighișoara. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottoman threat. The name Dracul means the dragon in Romanian, and it was from this that young Vlad would derive his own epithet, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. Later generations would associate the name with the Romanian word for devil, and given what Vlad would become, the association seemed apt. Vlad's childhood was one of privilege, shadowed by constant danger. As the son of the ruling prince, he received an education befitting a future ruler: languages, warfare, politics, and the complex art of medieval diplomacy. But Wallachia's throne was not inherited peacefully. It was taken by force, held by cunning, and lost through treachery. The ruling family was constantly at war with rival noble factions, and assassination was a legitimate tool of political advancement. Young Vlad learned early that mercy was weakness, and that power belonged to those willing to do whatever was necessary to seize and maintain it. The event that would shape Vlad's destiny, and perhaps explain his later brutality, occurred in 1442, when he was approximately 11 years old. His father, seeking to maintain peace with the Ottomans, agreed to send Vlad and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman court. The boys were to serve as guarantees of their father's loyalty. If Vlad II betrayed the Ottomans, his sons would pay the price with their lives. For the next 6 years, Vlad would live among his family's enemies, learning their language, their customs, and their methods of warfare, including, crucially, their methods of execution. The Ottoman court at Edirne was unlike anything the young Wallachian prince had ever experienced. Here was the center of a vast empire, a place of extraordinary wealth, sophisticated culture, and ruthless political intrigue. The young hostages lived in relative comfort. They were valuable bargaining chips after all, but they were never allowed to forget that their lives hung by a thread. Any perceived disloyalty from their father, any suspicion that Wallachia was conspiring with the Ottomans' enemies, and Vlad and Radu would face execution. It was a lesson in the arbitrary nature of power that Vlad would never forget. During his years of captivity, Vlad witnessed firsthand the Ottoman system of justice and punishment. The empire maintained order through a combination of efficient bureaucracy and spectacular violence. For serious crimes, rebellion, treason, or any challenge to the Sultan's authority, the punishment was often impalement. The technique had been used by various cultures throughout history, but the Ottomans had refined it into something approaching an art form. Vlad watched as prisoners were stripped, held down, and pierced by sharpened wooden stakes. He observed the different methods, some designed for quick death, others intended to prolong suffering for hours or even days. These lessons would later be applied with devastating effectiveness. The years in Ottoman captivity had different effects on the two brothers. Radu, the younger, adapted well to life at court. He converted to Islam, became a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II, and would eventually become an Ottoman puppet ruler of Wallachia, standing against his own brother. Vlad's reaction was quite different. Where Radu saw opportunity, Vlad saw only humiliation. Where Radu embraced his captors, Vlad harbored a burning hatred that would fuel his later campaigns of vengeance. The Ottomans had taught him their methods of terror, and he would use those methods against them with a ferocity that would shock the medieval world. In 1447, while Vlad was still a hostage, catastrophe struck his family. His father, Vlad II, was assassinated by Wallachian nobles loyal to the rival house of Danesh. Even more brutally, Vlad's older brother Mircea was captured by the people of Târgoviște, tortured and buried alive. The throne of Wallachia passed to the assassins, and the house of Draculești seemed finished. The Ottomans, seeing an opportunity to install a puppet ruler, briefly released Vlad to claim the throne. His first reign lasted mere months before he was driven out by Hungarian-backed forces. It was a humiliating failure, but it taught Vlad another crucial lesson. To rule Wallachia, one must be more ruthless than one's enemies. The following years were a time of exile, plotting, and preparation. Vlad sought refuge first with the Ottomans, then with the Hungarians, playing both sides against each other as he waited for his opportunity. In 1456, that opportunity came. With Hungarian backing, Vlad invaded Wallachia, defeated the ruling prince in battle, and claimed the throne for the second time. He was approximately 25 years old, hardened by years of captivity and exile, and filled with a cold fury toward everyone he believed had wronged him. The Ottomans who had held him hostage, the Boyars who had murdered his father and brother, and the rival claimants who had stolen his birthright. His first target was not the Ottomans, but the Wallachian nobility itself. The Boyars, the powerful noble families who controlled much of the country's wealth and military power, had long been a destabilizing force in Wallachian politics. They had murdered his father, killed his brother, and supported rival claimants to the throne. They represented everything that made Wallachia weak and divided. And so, shortly after his coronation, Vlad invited the noble families of the region to a great Easter feast at Târgoviște. Hundreds accepted the invitation, dressing in their finest clothes, bringing their families, expecting an opportunity to curry favor with the new prince. What happened next would become one of the most infamous episodes in Wallachian history. According to the chronicles, Vlad asked his guests how many princes they had lived through. The oldest among them proudly boasted of serving 7 different rulers, a testament in their minds to their political skill and survival instincts. But Vlad saw it differently. These were men whose loyalties shifted with the wind, who had betrayed prince after prince, whose self-interest had kept Wallachia weak and vulnerable. They were, in his mind, not survivors, but traitors. On his signal, Vlad's soldiers surrounded the hall. Some accounts say that Vlad had the oldest and most prominent boyars impaled on the spot, their screams adding a horrifying soundtrack to the Easter celebration. Others report that he had them arrested and marched in chains to the ruins of Ponari Castle, high in the mountains. There, still wearing their feast day finery, the nobles and their families were forced to labor under brutal conditions, rebuilding the castle stone by stone. Many died from exhaustion, exposure, or deliberate execution. By the time the castle was complete, an entire generation of the old nobility had been eliminated, and those who replaced them owed their positions entirely to Vlad. The message was clear. Loyalty to the prince was not optional, and betrayal would be punished with death. The destruction of the old nobility was merely the opening act of Vlad's campaign of terror. With his internal enemies eliminated or cowed into submission, he turned his attention to the broader population of Wallachia. His goal was nothing less than the complete transformation of society, the creation of a state where order reigned supreme, where crime was unthinkable, and where the prince's authority was absolute. The methods he employed to achieve this goal would earn him his infamous epithet and cement his reputation as one of the most feared rulers in European history. Impalement, the method of execution that became synonymous with Vlad's name, was not his invention. As we have seen, it was practiced by the Ottomans and had been used by various cultures throughout history. But Vlad elevated it to a scale and sophistication that had never been seen before. Under his rule, impalement became not just a method of execution, but a tool of political communication, a form of public art designed to inspire terror in all who witnessed it. The forests of the impaled that so horrified the Ottoman army were the culmination of years of practice. The technique itself was diabolically refined. The stake, typically a wooden pole sharpened to a point and oiled to reduce friction, could be inserted into the body through various orifices or through the abdomen. The most prolonged and agonizing form involved inserting the stake through the rectum or vagina and carefully positioning it so that it would gradually work its way through the body's internal organs without immediately piercing any vital areas. Done correctly, a victim could survive for days, fully conscious, watching as others were impaled around them, feeling the stake slowly rising through their body with every involuntary movement. The stakes were planted in the ground, raising the victims into the air where they could be seen from great distances. The height of the stake often corresponded to the rank of the victim, higher for nobles and important prisoners, lower for common criminals. In some accounts, the victims were arranged in geometric patterns, their positions forming elaborate designs that could be appreciated from a distance. Guards were sometimes posted to prevent friends or family members from ending the victim's suffering prematurely. Death, when it finally came, was often a relief. The scale of Vlad's impalements was staggering. While exact numbers are impossible to verify, the chroniclers of the time were often enemies or propagandists with reasons to exaggerate. Even conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands of people died on Vlad's stakes during his 6-year reign. German pamphlets from the period claimed that he had impaled over 100,000 victims. Romanian traditions, while celebrating him as a defender against the Ottomans, acknowledged that his methods were extraordinarily harsh. The landscape of Wallachia became dotted with the forests of the dead, grim monuments to the prince's power. But impalement was not Vlad's only method of execution. The chronicles record a catalogue of horrors that reads like a medieval compendium of torture. Victims were boiled alive in great cauldrons, their screams echoing across the countryside. Others were skinned alive, their raw flesh exposed to the elements until shock or infection claimed them. Tongues were torn out, eyes were gouged, noses and ears were cut off. Victims were burned, hanged, drowned, strangled, and hacked to pieces. In some accounts, Vlad forced family members to eat the cooked flesh of their executed relatives, adding a dimension of psychological torture to the physical agony. The creativity of Vlad's punishments seemed to know no bounds. According to the chronicles, he once had a group of Ottoman envoys executed because they refused to remove their turbans in his presence. A mark of respect, they claimed their religion forbade them from showing to a non-Muslim ruler. Vlad reportedly ordered the turbans nailed to their heads, declaring that he would help them maintain their religious custom forever. Whether this actually happened or was invented by propagandists, the story illustrates the reputation Vlad was cultivating, that of a ruler who would punish any slight, real or perceived, with extreme and imaginative violence. Women and children were not exempt from Vlad's wrath. Unfaithful wives, according to the chronicles, had their sexual organs cut out. Women who lost their virginity before marriage were subjected to similar mutilations or impaled through their private parts. Pregnant women suspected of infidelity were cut open so that Vlad could examine the fetus. These accounts, if true, suggest a particularly vicious misogyny underlying Vlad's violence, or perhaps simply a willingness to use any means necessary to enforce his vision of social order. The message was clear. In Vlad's Wallachia, the prince's law applied to everyone, and the punishments for transgression were absolute. The most famous story illustrating Vlad's approach to justice involved a golden cup. According to the chronicles, Vlad placed a golden cup at a public fountain in Târgoviște. Anyone could drink from it, but no one was to steal it. Despite its obvious value, the cup remained in place throughout Vlad's reign, undisturbed by thieves. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but its message captured something essential about Vlad's achievement. He had created, through sheer terror, a state where crime was unthinkable because the consequences were too horrible to risk. While Vlad's domestic terror was reshaping Wallachian society, a far greater conflict was brewing. The Ottoman Empire, under the dynamic leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, was at the height of its power and ambition. Having conquered Constantinople in 1453, an event that shocked Christendom and marked the final end of the Byzantine Empire, Mehmed was now looking to expand further into Europe. Wallachia, a vassal state that had long paid tribute to the Ottomans, lay directly in his path. For several years after taking the throne, Vlad maintained the uneasy peace with the Ottomans, paying the annual tribute and avoiding direct confrontation. But this was merely a tactical delay while he built up his forces and fortified his position. Vlad harbored no illusions about the Ottomans' ultimate intentions. They wanted Wallachia, and eventually they would come to take it. When that day came, he intended to be ready. More than ready. He intended to give them such a reception that they would never dare return. The break came in 1459, when Vlad refused to pay the annual tribute to the Sultan. This was an act of open defiance, a declaration that Wallachia would no longer be a vassal state. Mehmed responded by sending envoys to negotiate, or more accurately, to demand Vlad's submission. According to the chronicles, Vlad received the Ottoman ambassadors with apparent courtesy, but when they refused to remove their turbans as a sign of respect, he had the headwear nailed to their skulls. The message was unmistakable. Wallachia would fight. In the winter of 1461-1462, Vlad launched a devastating preemptive strike against the Ottoman territories south of the Danube. His army, numbering perhaps 23,000 men, A fraction of the force the Ottomans could muster swept through Bulgaria like a scourge. Towns were burned, garrisons were slaughtered, and the civilian population suffered terribly. Vlad's own letters to the Hungarian king claimed that he had killed over 23,000 enemies in a single campaign. Modern historians suggest these numbers may have been exaggerated, but even a fraction of that total represents an extraordinary level of destruction. The raids were not merely military operations. They were exercises in terror designed to weaken Ottoman resolve and demonstrate the cost of invading Wallachia. Vlad's soldiers took thousands of prisoners, many of whom were subsequently impaled in mass displays that turned the Bulgarian countryside into a charnel house. The message was clear. Any Ottoman advance into Wallachia would be met with the same fate. The raids also served a practical purpose. They disrupted Ottoman supply lines, destroyed crops and food stores, and forced the empire to divert resources to defensive measures. Sultan Mehmed could not ignore such a direct challenge to his authority. In the spring of 1462, he assembled one of the largest armies the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded. Estimates range from 90,000 to over 150,000 soldiers, and marched north toward Wallachia. The army included the elite Janissary Corps, thousands of cavalry, and a massive siege train capable of reducing any fortress to rubble. By any conventional measure, the campaign should have been over before it began. Wallachia's tiny army had no hope of meeting the Ottomans in open battle, but Vlad had no intention of fighting a conventional war. He employed what modern military theorists would call guerrilla tactics, scorched earth strategy, and psychological warfare, combined with his signature instrument of terror. As the Ottoman army advanced, they found the countryside stripped bare. Wells were poisoned, crops were burned, and villages were abandoned. The local population had either fled to the mountains or been forcibly relocated. There was no food to forage, no shelter to commandeer, and most importantly, no enemy to fight. The Ottoman army was fighting the land itself. Night after night, Vlad launched devastating attacks against the Ottoman camp. In what became known as the Night Attack of June 17, 1462, Vlad personally led a force of approximately 7,000 men in a surprise assault on the Ottoman positions. The attack came in the darkest hours before dawn, and for several terrifying hours, the largest army in the world was thrown into confusion. Vlad's objective was nothing less than the assassination of Sultan Mehmed himself, a decapitation strike that would have ended the campaign in a single blow. The attempt failed. Vlad's men attacked the wrong tent, killing 2 viziers but missing the Sultan, but the psychological impact was enormous. If the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was not safe in the middle of his own army, who could be? The constant harassment, the lack of supplies, and the summer heat took their toll on the Ottoman army. Disease spread through the camps, morale plummeted, and the soldiers grew increasingly superstitious about their invisible enemy. And then came the sight that would break their will entirely, the forest of the impaled outside Targovishte. 20,000 bodies, stretching as far as the eye could see, demonstrated exactly what fate awaited any Ottoman who fell into Vlad's hands. Even Mehmed, who had shown no mercy to the defenders of Constantinople, recognized that he was dealing with something beyond normal warfare. Among the many horrifying stories associated with Vlad the Impaler, none captures his combination of calculated cruelty and theatrical sadism quite like the accounts of his feasts among the dying. According to multiple contemporary sources, Vlad regularly dined among forests of the impaled, eating and drinking, while his victims writhed and screamed on the stakes around him. These were not merely acts of callousness, they were deliberate performances designed to demonstrate that the prince was beyond any normal human emotion, beyond mercy, beyond fear. The most detailed accounts come from German pamphlets printed in the decades after Vlad's death. These Dracula pamphlets were among the first mass-produced horror literature in European history, and they painted a picture of a monster in human form. In one account, Vlad invited a group of Ottoman envoys to dine with him, positioning their seats so that they had an unobstructed view of hundreds of impaled prisoners. As the envoys ate or tried to eat, Vlad conducted normal diplomatic conversation, apparently oblivious to the screams of agony surrounding them. When one envoy complained about the smell, Vlad had him impaled on a particularly tall stake so that he could be above the stench. Another account describes a feast held for Vlad's boyars and officials. The prince had ordered a mass execution of criminals, beggars, and political prisoners, and their impaled bodies formed a grotesque backdrop to the celebration. Throughout the evening, Vlad ate heartily, drank wine, and made small talk with his guests, while servants carefully stepped around pools of blood, and attendants ensured that the flames of the torches highlighted the suffering of the victims. Some chronicles claim that Vlad dipped his bread in the blood of the dying, though this detail may be exaggeration or invention designed to paint him as literally vampiric. The psychological purpose of these feasts was clear. They established Vlad as utterly inhuman, a ruler so far beyond the pale of normal morality that resistance was not merely futile, but insane. Who would plot against a prince who could eat dinner while watching men, women, and children die in agony around him? Who would betray a ruler who seemed to genuinely enjoy the suffering of others? The feasts were performances of absolute power, demonstrations that Vlad's will was law and that mercy was not merely absent from his character, but actively offensive to him. But the feasts among the impaled were merely the most theatrical of Vlad's atrocities. The chronicles record numerous other episodes that demonstrate his casual relationship with mass death. On one occasion, he reportedly invited all the sick, poor, and disabled of Wallachia to a great feast, promising them that in his kingdom no one would go hungry. When the beggars and invalids had assembled and begun to eat, Vlad had the building sealed and set on fire. Everyone inside burned to death. When asked about this, Vlad supposedly replied that he had done them a favor. They were no longer suffering from hunger or disease. This story, whether true or not, illustrates an important aspect of Vlad's psychology as understood by his contemporaries. He was not merely cruel, he operated according to a twisted logic that found justification for every atrocity. The sick and poor were a burden on society. By killing them, he was strengthening the nation. The boyars were disloyal. By slaughtering them, he was creating stability. The Ottomans were invaders. By terrorizing them, he was defending Christendom. Every act of brutality had a purpose, a reason, a justification. This made Vlad perhaps more frightening than a simple sadist. He was a monster with a philosophy. The chronicles also record Vlad's particular hatred for women who transgressed sexual norms. Adulteresses were subjected to especially gruesome punishments, their breasts cut off, their sexual organs mutilated, and their skin flayed before they were finally impaled through the genitals. Young women who lost their virginity before marriage suffered similar fates. The message was clear: female sexuality belonged to fathers and husbands, and any woman who claimed autonomy over her own body would pay with unimaginable suffering. These punishments served Vlad's vision of social order, but they also suggest a particular viciousness toward women that exceeded even his general capacity for cruelty. Merchants who cheated their customers learned that Vlad's justice applied to economic as well as sexual crimes. According to the chronicles, any merchant found using false weights or measures was impaled alongside common thieves and murderers. Foreign traders were required to conduct all business honestly or face the same fate. In one story, a merchant from Florence complained to Vlad that he had been robbed of a significant sum of gold while passing through Wallachia. Vlad had the entire town where the robbery occurred searched, and when the thief was found, he was impaled. The merchant's gold was returned, along with an extra coin. When the merchant pointed out the discrepancy, Vlad smiled and said, "If you had not mentioned it, you would have joined the thief on the stake." This story, like the tale of the Golden Cup, presents Vlad as a harsh but just ruler, one whose extreme methods produced a society of absolute honesty and order. It is worth noting that many of these more positive stories come from Romanian traditions, which have generally viewed Vlad as a national hero rather than a monster. The German pamphlets, by contrast, present him as purely demonic, with no redeeming qualities. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere between these extremes, though even the most sympathetic accounts cannot disguise the fundamental brutality of Vlad's methods. To fully understand Vlad the Impaler, we must examine not only what he did, but why he did it. The sheer scale and creativity of his violence were not random expressions of sadism. They were calculated tools of statecraft, designed to achieve specific political and military objectives. In this sense, Vlad was a pioneer of what modern strategists call strategic terror, the use of extreme violence to influence the behavior of enemies and populations. His methods were monstrous, but they were not mindless. The domestic terror that characterized Vlad's reign served several interlocking purposes. First and most obviously, it eliminated potential threats to his power. The boyar class that had murdered his father and brother, that had supported rival claimants to the throne, and that had kept Wallachia weak and divided for generations, this class was systematically destroyed. Those who survived owed their positions entirely to Vlad's favor, and knew that any hint of disloyalty would result in a gruesome death. The political landscape was fundamentally transformed. Second, the terror created a functioning state apparatus where none had existed before. Medieval Wallachia was a land of powerful nobles whose loyalty to the prince was contingent on their own interests. Vlad's methods changed this calculus. Suddenly, the risks of disloyalty were so extreme that obedience became the only rational choice. The tax collectors collected taxes honestly. The army followed orders without question. The merchants traded fairly. Crime virtually disappeared, not because the population had become virtuous, but because the consequences of being caught were too terrible to contemplate. Third, the terror served as a form of propaganda, both domestic and international. Within Wallachia, it established Vlad as an almost supernatural figure, a prince who could see everything, punish everything, and from whom no secret was safe. This image of omnipotence was cultivated deliberately through the theatrical nature of his punishments. The mass impalings, the feasts among the dead, the elaborate tortures, these were public spectacles designed to be witnessed and remembered. Stories spread from village to village, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until the very name of Vlad inspired paralyzing fear. Internationally, the terror served as a deterrent. Vlad was acutely aware that Wallachia could not defeat the Ottoman Empire in a conventional war. His army was too small, his resources too limited, and his country too exposed. But by establishing himself as the most dangerous and unpredictable ruler in Europe, he changed the strategic equation. Invading Wallachia was not merely a military operation, it was an expedition into a land ruled by a madman who would rather destroy his own country than surrender it. The forest of the impaled outside Târgoviște was the ultimate expression of this strategy, a message to the Ottomans that this was not a land worth conquering. The German pamphlets that spread Vlad's reputation across Europe served his purposes in another way. While they were intended to portray him as a monster, they also inadvertently advertised his effectiveness as a ruler. The stories of the Golden Cup, of crime-free streets, of merchants who dealt honestly for fear of their lives, these painted a picture of a land where order reigned supreme. For European rulers struggling with their own problems of crime, corruption, and noble resistance, there was something attractive about Vlad's methods, even if they could never be implemented in full. It's also worth noting that Vlad's violence, while extreme, was not entirely unprecedented in the context of medieval warfare. The sack of Constantinople in 1453 had seen Ottoman soldiers engage in mass rape, massacre, and the enslavement of the civilian population. The 100 Years' War between England and France had produced atrocities on both sides. The Spanish Inquisition was burning heretics across Iberia. In this context, Vlad's methods were different in degree rather than kind, more systematic, more theatrical, but not fundamentally alien to the standards of his time. What set Vlad apart was his willingness to apply extreme violence systematically and to use it as a tool of governance rather than merely a weapon of war. Other rulers tortured and executed their enemies, but they did so reactively in response to specific threats or crimes. Vlad proactively terrorized entire populations, creating a climate of fear that shaped behavior even when no immediate threat was present. This was innovative, in the worst possible sense of the word, and it anticipated techniques of population control that would later be employed by totalitarian regimes of the modern era. The effectiveness of Vlad's terror can be measured by its results. During his 6-year reign, Wallachia was transformed from a divided, weak state into a cohesive military power capable of defying the Ottoman Empire. The boyar class was broken. Crime was virtually eliminated. The economy functioned efficiently. And when the largest army in the world invaded, it was fought to a standstill by a force a fraction of its size. By any purely strategic measure, Vlad's methods worked. The cost in human suffering was incalculable, but from Vlad's perspective, that cost was borne by enemies, criminals, and traitors who deserved their fate. Despite his extraordinary efforts, Vlad's reign was ultimately doomed by the very forces he had spent his life fighting. The Ottoman invasion of 1462, while it failed to capture or kill Vlad, succeeded in fatally weakening his position. The Sultan, unable to conquer Wallachia by force, turned to a different strategy. He would replace Vlad with a puppet ruler, someone who could be controlled and who would keep Wallachia safely within the Ottoman sphere of influence. For this purpose, Mehmed turned to Vlad's own brother, Radu, who had remained in Ottoman service since their childhood captivity. Radu, now known as Radu the Beautiful for his physical appearance, was everything Vlad was not. Where Vlad was harsh and terrifying, Radu was charming and diplomatic. Where Vlad had harbored hatred for the Ottomans throughout his captivity, Radu had embraced their culture and converted to their faith. He had become a personal favorite of Sultan Mehmed. Some sources suggest the relationship was romantic or sexual in nature, and he was now the Ottomans' instrument for neutralizing the threat of Vlad Dracula. As the Ottoman army withdrew, Radu remained behind with a contingent of Turkish troops and, crucially, with Ottoman gold. He used this gold to buy what Vlad's terror could not, the loyalty of the surviving Wallachian nobility. For while Vlad had broken the power of the old boyar families, he had also made himself deeply unpopular with everyone who had anything to lose. The nobles who had survived his purges lived in constant fear. The peasants who had escaped his justice lived in constant dread. Given the choice between a terrifying tyrant and a charming prince backed by Ottoman power and money, many Wallachians chose the latter. Through the summer and fall of 1462, Vlad's support base crumbled. Nobles who had served him out of fear now defected to Radu, calculating that the Ottoman candidate was more likely to prevail and far less likely to impale them on a whim. Cities that had submitted to Vlad's rule now opened their gates to his brother. The army, exhausted by years of constant warfare and horrified by what they had been forced to do, began to melt away. Vlad found himself increasingly isolated, his kingdom shrinking around him. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. Vlad had counted on Hungarian support throughout his conflict with the Ottomans. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary had provided financial assistance and had publicly praised Vlad as a defender of Christendom. But Matthias was a shrewd politician, and he recognized that Vlad's extreme methods had made him more of a liability than an asset. The stories spreading across Europe portrayed not just Wallachia, but all of Eastern Christianity as a land of barbarism and horror. Moreover, Matthias had received a large sum from the Pope specifically for a crusade against the Ottomans, money that he had largely pocketed rather than spent. A convenient scapegoat was needed. In late 1462, Matthias had Vlad arrested on charges of treason and collaboration with the Ottomans. The evidence for these charges was almost certainly fabricated, possibly consisting of forged letters that purported to show Vlad negotiating with the Sultan. But the truth hardly mattered. Vlad was now a prisoner, confined in comfortable but inescapable captivity, while his brother ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman vassal. The Impaler's reign was over. Vlad would spend the next 12 years as Matthias's prisoner, held in the Hungarian capital of Buda and later at Visegrad. The conditions of his imprisonment were relatively lenient. He was a royal prisoner after all, and might prove useful in the future. According to some accounts, Vlad even maintained his taste for cruelty during this period, impaling birds and mice and displaying them in miniature versions of his infamous forests. Whether these stories are true or merely additions to the growing Dracula legend is impossible to say. During Vlad's imprisonment, Wallachia suffered under his brother's rule and subsequent instability. Radu proved to be a weak ruler, dependent on Ottoman support and unable to control the nobles he had bribed into submission. When he died in 1475, likely of syphilis, the throne passed through a series of short-lived princes, none of whom could establish lasting authority. The very chaos that Vlad had sought to end through terror had returned with a vengeance. Meanwhile, Vlad was working to rebuild his position. He converted from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism, a gesture that pleased his Hungarian captors and opened doors in the courts of Catholic Europe. He married a relative of King Matthias, cementing an alliance that would prove crucial to his eventual return. And he waited, watching as Wallachia descended into anarchy and the Ottomans grew ever more confident, knowing that eventually the Hungarians would need someone capable of confronting the Turkish threat. In 1476, 14 years after his overthrow, Vlad finally got his chance to return to power. The political situation had shifted dramatically. The Ottoman Empire, now under the aging but still formidable Mehmed II, was pressing harder than ever against Hungary's borders. Wallachia was a chaotic mess, its weakness inviting Ottoman intervention and threatening to become a launching point for attacks deeper into Christian Europe. King Matthias needed a strong ruler in Wallachia, and whatever Vlad's faults, no one could deny his effectiveness at confronting the Ottomans. With Hungarian backing and a small army of loyal followers, Vlad invaded Wallachia in the fall of 1476. The campaign was swift and brutal. Vlad had not grown gentle during his years of captivity. The current prince, a minor noble named Basarab Laiota, fled before him, and by November, Vlad was once again seated on the Wallachian throne. It was his third reign, and it would last less than 2 months. The details of Vlad's final weeks are frustratingly sparse. The chronicles that recorded his earlier atrocities in such detail are largely silent about this brief final chapter. We know that he attempted to consolidate his position, reaching out to potential allies and beginning to rebuild the power structure that had been dismantled during his absence. We know that he faced immediate threats from multiple directions. Basarab Laiota was gathering forces for a counterattack, and the Ottomans were certain to respond to this resurrection of their old enemy. The end came in late December 1476, or early January 1477. The exact date and circumstances remain unclear. According to some accounts, Vlad was killed in battle against Ottoman forces near Bucharest. Other sources suggest he was assassinated by his own men, boyars who feared a return to the terror of his first reign, or agents paid by the Ottomans to eliminate the threat once and for all. Some chronicles claim that he was killed by mistake, cut down by his own soldiers in the confusion of battle because he was wearing Turkish clothing he had captured as a trophy. What is certain is that Vlad's body was decapitated, and his head was sent to Constantinople as a trophy for Sultan Mehmed. There, it was displayed on a stake above the city gates, a grimly appropriate end for the man who had impaled so many thousands of Ottoman prisoners. The sight of the impaler's head, mounted like one of his own victims, must have brought grim satisfaction to the Sultan and to the many who had suffered under Vlad's reign. The dragon's son was dead at last. Vlad's body was reportedly buried at the Snagov monastery on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. In the 20th century, archaeologists excavated what was believed to be his grave, but found it empty, or nearly so. This discovery added another layer to the Dracula legend, the vampire count whose body vanished from its tomb. A nearby grave did contain a decapitated skeleton in rich clothes, and this may be Vlad's actual resting place, though certainty is impossible after 5 centuries. The immediate aftermath of Vlad's death saw Wallachia return to its familiar pattern of instability and Ottoman vassalage. The dream of an independent, powerful Wallachian state died with its most fearsome champion. The boyars returned to power, foreign armies crossed the land at will, and the peasants continued to suffer as they always had. Whatever order Vlad had imposed through terror evaporated within years of his death, but Vlad's legacy was only beginning. In the decades after his death, his reputation spread across Europe through the German pamphlets and Russian chronicles that portrayed him as either a monster or a hero. The printing press, recently invented, allowed these accounts to reach audiences that would never have learned of an obscure Wallachian prince through traditional means. Vlad became one of the first celebrities of the printed age, famous not for his accomplishments, but for his atrocities. The transformation of Vlad the Impaler from historical figure to legendary monster began during his own lifetime, but accelerated dramatically after his death. The German-speaking regions of Europe, which had trading connections to Wallachia and had received refugees from Vlad's terror, produced a series of pamphlets that portrayed him in the most negative possible light. These Dracula pamphlets were among the earliest examples of mass-produced popular literature, and they established many of the stories that would define Vlad's reputation for centuries. The pamphlets bore titles like The Story of a Bloodthirsty Madman Called Dracula of Wallachia, and competed to present the most horrifying account of the prince's deeds. They described the mass impalings in graphic detail, complete with woodcut illustrations showing forests of stakes and cauldrons of boiling victims. They recounted the stories of the Easter massacre, the feasts among the dead, the nailing of turbans to ambassadors' heads, and dozens of other atrocities, both real and imagined. The line between historical fact and sensational fiction blurred almost immediately. Russian chronicles of the same period presented a markedly different picture. Writing from the perspective of Orthodox Christianity, Russian authors viewed Vlad as a defender of the faith against the Ottoman Muslim invaders. Yes, his methods were extreme, but extreme times called for extreme measures. The stories of harsh but fair justice, of the golden cup of crime-free streets, these elements dominated the Russian accounts, presenting Vlad as a stern but righteous ruler who did what was necessary to protect his people and his faith. Romanian folk tradition developed yet another perspective. In the lands that had suffered most directly under Vlad's rule, he was remembered with a mixture of fear, respect, and something approaching national pride. He was the prince who had stood up to the mighty Ottomans, who had made the Sultan himself tremble, who had shown that a small nation could defy the greatest power on earth if it had the will to pay the price. The atrocities were not forgotten, but they were contextualized, seen as the necessary costs of survival in a brutal world. These three strands, the German horror stories, the Russian heroic narratives, and the Romanian nationalist legends, would interweave over the centuries, creating an image of Vlad that was more myth than man. Each generation added new elements, new stories, new interpretations. The historical prince became a symbol onto which observers could project their own fears, desires, and political agendas. Vlad the man was lost, replaced by Vlad the Legend. The most dramatic transformation, however, came in 1897 when Irish author Bram Stoker published his novel Dracula. Stoker had researched Eastern European history and folklore while writing his book, and he borrowed the name and some elements of the legend for his vampiric count. The connection between the historical Vlad and Stoker's fictional vampire was relatively thin. They shared a name, a vaguely Eastern European origin, and a reputation for cruelty, but little else. Yet, the novel's enormous success permanently linked the two figures in popular imagination. After Stoker's novel, Vlad the Impaler could never escape his association with vampirism. Every subsequent adaptation of the Dracula story, from silent films to modern blockbusters, reinforced the connection. The historical prince who had terrorized 15th century Europe became conflated with the supernatural creature who drank blood and rose from the grave. The real horrors of Vlad's reign were overshadowed by fictional horrors that, ironically, were far less disturbing than the truth. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of Vlad's legacy. The fictional vampire Dracula is actually less frightening than the historical Vlad the Impaler. A vampire is a supernatural creature, operating according to rules that remove it from the realm of normal human experience. Vlad was a man, a human being who chose, deliberately and systematically, to inflict suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. The forest of the impaled was not the work of a monster from beyond the grave, but of a Christian prince, educated in the courts of kings, who decided that this was the most effective way to achieve his goals. That is truly terrifying. More than 5 centuries after his death, Vlad the Impaler remains a subject of fascination and debate. Was he a monster whose crimes cry out across the centuries for condemnation? Was he a harsh but effective ruler who did what was necessary to preserve his nation against overwhelming odds? Was he a product of his brutal times, no worse than many other medieval princes whose crimes have been forgotten? Or was he something unprecedented, a pioneer of systematic terror whose methods anticipated the horrors of the modern age? Different perspectives continue to offer different answers. In Romania, Vlad remains a national hero, his image appearing on stamps and monuments, his name invoked as a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. The communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu particularly promoted this interpretation, seeing in Vlad's defiance of the Ottomans a model for Romanian resistance against Soviet influence. Even today, Romanian historians tend to emphasize the political and military context of Vlad's actions, while downplaying or contextualizing his atrocities. In the Western imagination, Vlad remains primarily a figure of horror, his historical reality obscured by the shadow of Stoker's vampire. The tourist industry of Transylvania trades heavily on the Dracula connection, offering visitors tours of Dracula's castle, a building Vlad never inhabited, and themed merchandise that reduces a complex historical figure to a Halloween costume. The real Vlad, in all his disturbing humanity, is lost behind the fanged image of his fictional namesake. Scholars who have attempted to assess Vlad's reign objectively face significant challenges. The primary sources are limited and often contradictory. The German pamphlets were clearly hostile propaganda designed to portray Vlad in the worst possible light for reasons both commercial and political. The Russian chronicles were shaped by religious and political agendas of their own. Even the Romanian traditions, while more sympathetic, developed over centuries and cannot be accepted uncritically as historical fact. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Vlad did indeed practice impalement on a massive scale. The multiple independent sources, the consistency of the accounts across different traditions, and the reaction of the Ottoman army outside Târgoviște all point to the reality of the forests of the dead. The exact numbers may have been exaggerated. Propagandists on all sides had reasons to inflate the body count, but the basic fact of mass impalement is not seriously disputed by any historian. It also seems clear that Vlad used terror deliberately and systematically as a tool of statecraft. He was not a random sadist, killing for pleasure. His violence had purposes: eliminating political rivals, enforcing laws, deterring enemies, and creating a climate of fear that enabled centralized rule. This does not make his actions morally acceptable. Systematic evil is still evil, but it does distinguish him from simple psychopathy. Vlad knew exactly what he was doing and why. The question of Vlad's mental state remains unanswerable from this distance. Did his years as a hostage in the Ottoman court warp his psychology, creating the capacity for cruelty that manifested so spectacularly in later life? Did witnessing the executions of his father and brother plant seeds of vengeance that grew into something monstrous? Did he genuinely believe that his methods were necessary for the survival of his nation and his faith? Or was he simply a man without empathy, who found power in inflicting pain and created elaborate justifications for indulging his appetites? The sources do not allow us to peer into his soul. What we can say is that Vlad's reign represented something significant in the history of political violence. His systematic use of terror, his theatrical displays of cruelty, his transformation of execution into spectacle, these anticipated techniques that would be employed by totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The Nazis and the Soviets also used mass violence strategically, creating systems of terror designed to paralyze opposition and enforce obedience. Whether Vlad was their predecessor, or merely a shared symptom of humanity's capacity for organized cruelty, is an open question. For us today, Vlad the Impaler serves as a reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. The forests of the impaled were not built by aliens or demons, but by men. Men following orders, men convinced of their righteousness, men who had been conditioned to see their victims as enemies deserving of their fate. Understanding Vlad means understanding something deeply uncomfortable about our own nature. The monster was not supernatural. He was terrifyingly human. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Vlad Dracula's life and legend. The vampire of fiction can be defeated with garlic and holy water, destroyed by sunlight, conquered by the forces of good. But the darkness in the human heart, the capacity for cruelty, the will to power, the ability to rationalize the unforgivable, these cannot be so easily vanquished. They exist in every age, in every nation, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Vlad the Impaler showed us what that darkness looks like when it takes the throne. The forests of the dead are gone, but the impulse that created them remains. That is the true horror of the Dracula story, and it requires no fangs to terrify. As the sun sets over the Carpathian Mountains, casting long shadows across the ruins of Poenari Castle, one can almost hear the echoes of that terrible time. The screams of the dying, the crows circling overhead, the whisper of the wind through forests that once held darker ornaments than leaves. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, has been dead for more than 500 years, but his legacy endures in history books and horror films, in Romanian national memory and Transylvanian tourist traps, in our endless fascination with the outer limits of human cruelty. He was the son of the dragon who became the devil. He was a child hostage who grew into a nightmare. He was a minor prince who defied the mightiest empire on earth. He was a master of terror who created order through horror. He was Vlad the Impaler, and the world will never forget what he did. Whether we remember him as a monster or a hero, a madman or a political genius, one thing is certain: the real Vlad Dracula was far more terrifying than any vampire. He did not need supernatural powers to inspire fear that echoed through the centuries. He needed only a sharpened stake, the will to use it, and the cold conviction that his cause justified any cruelty.